Our guest today is Dr. David Bobb. David is currently the Executive Director of Citizen Education for Hillsdale College and is also a lecturer in politics. He is the founding director of two national centers for Hillsdale, the Washington, D.C. based Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, directly across the street, and the Hoagland Center for Teacher Excellence. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, and the Claremont Review of Books, and he is a contributing editor to the U.S. Constitution, a reader. On December 16th, he is pleased to note that he will be taking a new position as president of the Bill of Rights Institute in Arlington, Virginia. With a national network of some 30,000 teachers, the Institute is committed to expand its outreach, especially directly to high school students. Dr. Bobb will continue his association with our friends at Hillsdale College in a variety of both formal and informal collaborations. Congratulations, David, on your new position, and welcome to Heritage. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me today. It's a great privilege to be with you all today. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with the Heritage Foundation on a number of projects and appreciate very much the excellent work that you do in Washington. Anything that I characterize or say about Washington that's negative does not apply to the Heritage Foundation. Congress is still in session today, but I hear that the Humility Caucus is going to be taking a little breather. I don't know that they're going to have a quorum even yet, maybe 2028 or so. A few years ago, in 2009, at the inauguration of President Barack Obama, Bono, the lead singer of U2, said this: "We don't do humility very well." That might as well be the motto of Washington, D.C. Walk a block from here, and you'll be at the Hart Senate Office Building. Walk a couple blocks beyond that, and you'll be at the United States Capitol Building. Just a little further then are the House Office Buildings. From this end of Pennsylvania Avenue then, where you're standing, the House Office Buildings, to the other at 1600, in this town, you'll find the fabled corridors of power, full of people who are ambitious, bright, brimming with ambition, and drawn ineluctably to positions of power and prestige. Politico doesn't publish the 50 most humble politicians. You can't drive the day with tales of meekness. And while humility is invoked by lots of politicians on their election day, right? They're humbled that the voice of the people has been heard. There's a lot more arrogance to go around in this town than its opposite. So self-assured, self-important, self-intoxicated, and self-involved as Washington, one might wonder whether is humility possible at all here. In January of 2013, President Barack Obama urged the adoption of humility by our nation and by our elected leadership. He did so at the National Prayer Breakfast. Let me quote just a bit. "And so my hope is that humility carries over every day, every moment," end quote. Paying tribute to Abraham Lincoln and to Martin Luther King Jr., the president said that, quote, "In the midst of all these debates, we must keep that same humility that Dr. King and Lincoln and George Washington and all our great leaders understood is at the core of true leadership," end quote. Now, this was not the last time that Mr. Obama has spoken of humility. In April 2013, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the president said, quote, "I recognize that the press and I have different jobs to do. My job is to be president. Your job is to keep me humble. Frankly, I think I'm doing a better job." Now, he was making light of the situation and making an attempt at a joke, I guess, as we see from the gales of laughter here. But Barack Obama often portrays himself, as he did at the prayer breakfast in January 2013, as someone who is drawn deeply from the example of Lincoln, as someone who has even learned from the example of Lincoln's humility. Now, take one example of President Obama's invocation of our 16th president. As our 44th president said in 2010, quote, "We believe government has to be lean and efficient. We believe that free enterprise is the greatest engine for prosperity ever known to man. But in the words of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, we also believe that government should and must do for the people what they cannot do by themselves individually," end quote. Now here's the actual statement by Lincoln. This is from a statement that he made in 1854. Quote, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all, or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In all that the people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere," end quote. What's the difference between the two? Barack Obama's version and the original? Well, the difference is that whereas Lincoln leaves government action as the last resort, Obama makes government action the focal point. Here's another comparison between the 44th and the 16th. Quote, "I was wrong and you were right." No, that was not President Obama's statement on Obamacare. If you'll recall, what he said a few days ago was, quote, "There is no doubt that the way I put that forward unequivocally ended up not being accurate." You got that? "I was wrong and you were right" was the statement President Lincoln made to General Grant, even before the two men had ever met in person, about Grant's strategic decision-making that resulted in the pivotal and very important battle of Vicksburg victory by the Union forces. That was in July 1863. Lincoln, in admitting he was wrong and noting how right Grant was, also added this, that Grant had done an almost inestimable service for the country. How often have we ever heard today a leader state with clarity and concision that he or she is wrong, and then, and this is a very important follow-on action, change course? What Washingtonians today fear is not being wrong, but being irrelevant. It's influence that is the key, being a game changer. If Washingtonians think of humility at all, it's to worry that being humble is the best way to be sidelined. Why should I become a wimp? The hard-charging individual wonders, believing that humble folks must be shy and retiring, never forceful or magnetic. Today's achievers cannot imagine themselves ever sitting on the sidelines. Humble people, they think, have poor self-esteem and probably even hate themselves. They're pushovers, meek, timid, weak. To become humble or in politics or business, or even in daily life, is to give up on the possibility of achieving anything of significance. That's our current zeitgeist. Now go back more than 200 years, and you'll find a young Benjamin Franklin wrestling with precisely this dilemma. He was ambitious. In his 20s, Franklin looked about his life and saw more disorder than he liked. He saw a lack of frugality. He saw other qualities in himself that he wished to remedy. And as he molded his character and became the man that he wanted to be, he set out, as Franklin was prone to do, on a very exacting, systematic project that he called moral perfection. Maybe some of you have read about this in his autobiography. What he said is, in making up a list of about a dozen things that he needed to improve in, things like temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality. The rest of the list I can add here as well. Industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, then tranquility and chastity. So he made this list of 12, and he said if he were to work on each one assiduously, and when he made an error, when he ran afoul of one of these virtues, he would mark it down in his book, a little black mark. And perhaps after enough marks, he would have mastered it. Well, so that was his plan. He went to a friend of his and said, "What do you think of my list?" The friend told Benjamin Franklin something that had to hurt a little. He said, "You're arrogant." Now, to Benjamin Franklin's credit, he took that under advisement and added to his list of a dozen one more: humility. And the injunction that he gave to himself was simple: imitate Jesus and Socrates. In reality, Franklin wrote in 1784, and here I'm quoting from his autobiography, "There is perhaps no one of our natural passions so hard to subdue as pride. Disguise it, struggle with it, beat it down, stifle it, mortify it as much as one pleases. It is still alive and will every now and then peep out and show itself." End quote. This is a really hard thing to conquer. No one is naturally humble, but pride comes very quickly to all of us. That's the argument I make in this book, and Franklin bears witness to this in his own life. But he also, once he took this project on of trying to master humility, recognized that there's no easy 12-step program, 13-step program, right? There's no easy way to master humility, because just as soon as you think that you've mastered humility, you might become proud of it, right? This is the way that Franklin expressed it. You will see pride perhaps often in this history, that is the history of himself. For even if I could conceive that I had completely overcome it, I should probably be proud of my humility. Now, Franklin's dilemma is America's dilemma. Pride is a national as well as a personal challenge. Written before the United States had a great deal about which to be proud, that struggle would intensify as America ascended to new heights of wealth and prestige. How to become humble and stay humble was a constant challenge. Like the young Franklin, young America possessed an extraordinary ambition for significance. Both aspired to be great. Franklin's dilemma is America's dilemma. How can a nation be humble and stay humble while at the same time achieving greatness? When you're as great as I am, Muhammad Ali said, it's hard to be humble. The greater you are, the more humility you're supposed to have. That's the scripture sort of teaching. That's the biblical injunction. This is true for individuals as well as nations. But what then is humility, we might ask? Humility requires exacting and often painful self-knowledge, but especially for one who thinks himself or herself great. The humble person must acknowledge that he or she is not self-made, nor at the center of the universe. Unblinkered self-knowledge reveals our imperfections. To be humble requires that we admit when we are wrong and then change course. Humility, we might say, is the soul's state of self-knowledge in which we put others ahead of ourselves in thought, word, and deed, despite our tendency to self-aggrandizement. The 13th century theologian St. Thomas Aquinas argued that humility and the high virtue of magnanimity, or greatness of soul, are twins. Magnanimity guides the gaze of individuals to the heights. Humility issues a warning against flying too high. As Thomas stated about humility, it represses rather than adopts a pushful and self-confident temper. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Pushful. That word captures much about human striving. Pushful people, of whom there might be just a few in Washington, D.C., seek greater power and recognition at the expense of others. They are puffed up with their own worth. Their elbows are always sharpened and ready to be used. Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, the two figures I'd like to speak to this afternoon, were not immune to pushfulness or puffery. They were not born humble any more than they were born great. Humility came no easier to them than did greatness. What might they teach us today? Well, we sometimes associate Abraham Lincoln with humility just because of his upbringing. We speak of his humble roots, just as we sometimes today think of a politician's humble roots. You know, it's one of those usual tropes, right, for a politician to trot out how hard it was in his upbringing or how hard his parents or grandparents worked, as if they could sort of wrap themselves in the mantle of humility of their forebears. As the old saw goes, Lincoln was born in a log cabin he built with his own hands. Well, despite that kind of cloud of humility that hovered above Lincoln's birth, he was known by those closest to him as a man of tremendous ambition. He was extraordinarily ambitious. What made him rare was the quality that made, I would argue, George Washington rare, which was that despite that ambition, and in part because of it, they were able to channel, tame the problem of pride, the temptation, and become great. As Lincoln's longtime law partner William Herndon said of Abraham Lincoln, quote, his ambition was a little engine that knew no rest, end quote. Lincoln found himself early in his life stymied at almost every turn. This was a man who lost his seat for the state legislature. He saw his law partner go on to win a seat in Congress before he did. When Lincoln finally did win a seat in Congress, it was an ignominious one term. He made a speech on the floor of the House saying, you know, I'm a war hero, right? And here was what he said. Quote, I had as good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. And although I never fainted from the loss of blood, I can truly say I was very often hungry. Right? He's making fun of himself, of his futility. He had a failed romance early on. So despondent was he that his good friend and roommate hid the razors in the house from him. This was a man who knew failure. He had a failed business enterprise. By the time that Alexander the Great had conquered the world, Abraham Lincoln felt himself a miserable flop. But one of his really great strengths was resolution. Another was honesty. And I think what allowed Lincoln to move beyond those difficulties was a recognition that ultimately, if he was to achieve anything in life, it was not going to be in service just of his own ego. That's certainly what George Washington had to do. You know, Washington as a young man had that same sort of burning passion for significance. You see it here in the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings that land in Washington, D.C., wanting to make their mark. How do you do that? Well, in George Washington's case, it was starting a global conflagration, right? What came to be known as the French and Indian War. Washington and Lincoln had to tame that pride and recognize that if they were to truly be great, it was going to have to be because of a cause that was greater than their own self-aggrandizement. And that's a very hard lesson to come to. Think of what Lincoln came to discover, even in the midst of his own personal tribulations. Nowhere in the world, he said, is presented a government of so much liberty and equality. To the humblest and poorest amongst us are held out the highest privileges and positions. Humility, I argue, is not weakness. It really is a kind of hidden strength. It has to be tapped into. What Lincoln came to realize and stood foursquare on throughout his political life was that slavery was a great moral, political, and social evil. He fought for that. And he came to recognize, just as the Republican Party did, and then the two met in a most providential meeting in history, with the recognition that to stamp out slavery, one had to stand strongly upon our constitutional foundation. Lincoln's speeches, early and late in life, and throughout his life, were full of praise and tribute to the founders, not out of some sort of antiquarian relish for the past, but rather in thinking about the application that he could learn for the present dilemma that he faced. And he knew that the stalwart founding dedication was something that had to be reborn each generation. That kind of stance was what led Frederick Douglass to just about a mile away from here, at the dedication of the Lincoln statue at Lincoln Park, to say these words about the indefatigable work of Abraham Lincoln. Let me quote from this passage from Frederick Douglass. "Few great public men have ever been the victims of fiercer denunciation than Abraham Lincoln was during his administration. He was often wounded in the house of his friends. Reproaches came thick and fast upon him from within and from without, and from opposite quarters. He was assailed by abolitionists. He was assailed by slaveholders. He was assailed by the men who were for peace at any price. He was assailed by those who were for a more prosecution of the war. He was assailed for not making the war an abolition war, and he was bitterly assailed for making the war an abolition war." You see Douglass's point? Lincoln, at every turn, had to be, in large measure, a party of one. Douglass knew something about that. For as I'll say in just a few minutes, his own journey was one of standing against the United States Constitution to standing on it. In the history of great oratory, there is no more hopeful and yet no more sorrowful speech than Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural. This was delivered in January 1865, just 4 months before the end of the Civil War. "It is not for us to speak for God," Lincoln said. This humble realization, one that Lincoln lived throughout his life, came into the fullness of his intellectual, moral, and political reasoning in that great speech. Its echo is heard throughout the address. This is an address in which he's thinking in a very profound way about the responsibilities of citizens and our relationship to God. "The Almighty has his own purposes," Lincoln said halfway through the address. And then, quoting from Matthew's Gospel, Lincoln said, "Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh." Slavery can be supposed to be among those offenses, Lincoln stated, and the war to end it was due, quote, "by whom the offense came," end quote. This realization did not mean, Lincoln quickly added, that anyone should welcome the war. "Fondly do we hope," he said, "fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away," end quote. If it did not immediately pass, however, and here I quote again, "every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword," we must conclude, as was said in the Psalms, "the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Now, how did Lincoln come up with this quotation? I would gather that many of you in this room and that many here in Washington have had a chance to climb up those steps of the Lincoln Memorial and to see the entirety of the second inaugural on the wall there. Lincoln's curious choice of quotation from the New Testament Gospel of Matthew captures Jesus' words in response to a question posed to him by a disciple. That question was, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" The response by Jesus was to call forth a child and admonish the adults to be more like the little one. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. To cause a child to sin is an offense worthy of death. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come, Jesus said. To the greatest, you must be the most humble. In the aftermath of the war, Lincoln urged humility for both the North and the South, not just about what God would have them do, but how they should act toward each other. Humility has a horizontal as well as a vertical component. Even after the great losses in his own life and the near death of the Union he loved, Lincoln had lost his 11-year-old son, Willie, in some of the darkest days of the war in 1862. Lincoln came to the realization that however distant or inscrutable God might be, He does not give up on justice. Lincoln closed his second inaugural address with a challenge to the American people. Many of you probably know this passage well. Let me quote it. "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne battle, and for his widow, and for his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." End quote. This is a summons to all human beings to chasten their pride. Act with intellectual humility, Lincoln said, or a willingness to admit when you're wrong. Act with spiritual humility, not presuming that your ways are God's. Act with a wisdom in all that you do, and act firmly for the right. Humility is not a call to timidity. Put aside malice and put on charity. A child is exemplary of humility, Jesus said, in words that Lincoln took to heart. A child, Lincoln knew, perhaps thinking of Willie or Edward or the thousands of boys and girls left orphaned by the Civil War, is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Not the powerful or the prestigious or those puffed up with pride, but a child. Now, Frederick Douglass was there that day. There were tens of thousands of Washingtonians out. It was a very wet and muddy day, and after the conclusion of the inauguration, Frederick Douglass made his way back to the White House. He had been invited by the president to see him, and having been at first denied entry to the White House, and the president remedying that disservice to Douglass, he was welcomed in. Immediately, Lincoln asked Frederick Douglass what he thought of the speech. He had worked very hard on this speech and was curious as to what his friend, Frederick Douglass, thought. "Mr. Lincoln," Douglass said, "that was a sacred effort." Now, in the same year in which Illinois became a state, in which Abraham Lincoln's mother died, Frederick Douglass was born. He never knew for sure the day of his birth or the month. For a while, he was even unsure of the year. How did a man with that kind of a beginning attain that kind of power? That's what I want to close with today. Frederick Douglass's best guess was that he was born in February of 1818. Officially, his mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He later used the surname Stanley, then Johnson, then finally Douglass, after the lead character, plus an S added at the end in Sir Walter Scott's poem Lady of the Lake. Douglass did not know the identity of his father, but it was probably his first master, a man by the name of Aaron Anthony. This person was the chief overseer of properties for a Colonel Edward Lloyd, one of Maryland's wealthiest men. Young Freddie hardly knew his mother. She lived on a neighboring farm, and she died before he turned 8 years old. His early years, Frederick Douglass later wrote in one of the 3 autobiographies he penned, lacked, quote, an intelligible beginning. Let me give you a sense of why he came to that conclusion. Slavery was a self-perpetuating cycle of disordered pride and debased conduct. Douglass called it the soul-crushing and death-dealing character of slavery. And he always used that in the context of the arrogance that was almost literally etched on the faces of the slave masters. Those slave masters used humiliation as their means of control. Douglass witnessed no more harrowing example of humiliation than Colonel Lloyd's whipping of old Barney, a slave who was about as old as his imperious owner. Let me quote briefly from Douglass's account. These 2 men were both advanced in years. There were the silver locks of the master and the bald and toil-worn brow of the slave, superior and inferior here, powerful and weak here, but equals before God. That's Douglass's description. Old Barney, described further by Douglass as possessing a respectful and dignified bearing, was the keeper of the Lloyd stable, along with his son, who was called Young Barney. Obsessed with his horses, Lloyd the master was always finding fault with their care. After noting some perceived infraction of the stable rules by Old Barney, Lloyd ordered the old slave to kneel. He then delivered 30 lashes with the horsewhip. Douglass had watched countless whippings, but at this one he was shocked, his word, to see, quote, the spectacle of an aged man, a husband and a father, humbly kneeling before his fellow man, taking the lashes patiently with no resistance, responding to each blow with only a shrug of the shoulders and a groan. What young Freddie Bailey witnessed in that incident, he later said, was slavery in its truest color. Now, this gives you a sense of why, for Douglass growing up, humility did not have any kind of positive connotation. Humility, the word, comes from the idea of humilis, the ground, the dirt, literally, the earth. He slept on the ground for most of his childhood. The whippings that he witnessed were almost always like this one, with the slave being forced to that dirt. Humility meant humiliation. But what Douglass came to realize over the course of his life is that even as he gained a healthy pride in who he was and overcame the humiliation of his upbringing, he also was able to gain a greatness in a kind of humility. That's the story that I want to tell just a little bit here. For Douglass, slavery was tyranny. And what he realized very quickly as a bright young fellow is that the way that he could begin to emerge from the tyranny of his upbringing was through an intellectual awakening. He loved the fact that his mother, a slave, had learned how to read, and he wanted that same thing in his life. He connived by various means to get himself some reading lessons, and having been sent to Baltimore, where the wife of his slave owner agreed to continue his lessons in reading, Douglass recognized very quickly that there was something like liberty. He found a book, and it was a book full of stories like of George Washington, and more ancient stories that pointed to the possibility of liberty and away from tyranny. If he learns to read, his master said, though, the Bible especially, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. The master then forbade his wife to continue the reading lessons. Now, what Douglass realized is that if he was going to be unfit, if reading was going to make him unfit, then unfit he wanted to become. Now, what happened, to make a very long story shorter, is that the master resolved that Douglass, having gained the intellectual awakening, was now a danger, right? He might flee. He has reason to recognize that there's a different way. He was coming to an awakening also spiritually, which is very interesting. You see, slavery and the enslavement that Douglass knew had been done in the name of God. So that when Douglass heard about things related to the divine, he associated that with his own enslavement and that of his people. It took an awakening brought by an elder and a man who became kind of a mentor to say, you know what? That's not really the teaching in the Bible. It doesn't sanction and condone the things that are being done to you in the name of the Lord. That's not the way of liberty. Nonetheless, Douglass found himself sent off to be broken, quite literally. A person who was known as one of the most fearsome slave breakers in that part of Maryland was tasked with trying to take Douglass and turn his will into nothing. This spirit made me a free man in fact, though I still remained a slave in form. That's the statement of Douglass about his own awakening. What he realized gradually is that he didn't have to put up with the beatings. That just like that slave that he had witnessed, old Barney, for whom the physicality of the thing was not the defining thing, because as terrible as those whippings were, as those beatings that he endured at the hands of his slave breaker, Douglass knew that it couldn't touch the innermost part of who he was. It couldn't take his soul. The Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, paints a vivid portrait of this kind of thing, and he gives it a name, the point of view. For people that resisted the tyranny of the Soviet Union, he said, for people who could endure the threat of the loss of even their life and not bend, not crumble, they had this thing that sort of provided this point of leverage, a point of resistance. He called it the point of view. And that's, I think, what Douglass gained. He decided, having endured the predations of this slave breaker, that he was not going to do it anymore. And one day, when this guy jumped out as he was wont to do and attacked him, Douglass resisted. Now, of course, this was an extremely dangerous thing to do, right? Because he threatened his very existence. Douglass, by this point, was a strong young man. He could have put that guy probably down, but he decided not to. He did resist physically, and you know what? After that time, Edward Covey never laid another finger on Douglass. Covey tried to get the people around him, fellow slaves, to join him in subduing Douglass, but they didn't join him. Douglass had resisted him in physical form because of the inner awakening, the transformation that had happened in his interior. And it took another 6 months before Douglass was able to escape from the grips of that terrible institution. But once he did, and when he went north to Massachusetts and then New York, we know, when the world knows, what an amazing career he launched into. He was immediately discovered by, as he began speaking to the sort of background and speaking to his life experience, he was discovered by William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison furthered his speaking career, gave him a bigger platform, and sometimes Douglass was even doubted. You couldn't possibly have been enslaved. You speak too ably. To that challenge, Douglass would say, if you have to know, I don't have a diploma, except the one that's written on my back. This is a guy that really was able to articulate not only the evil of slavery, but the possibility of abolitionism. But you know, his whole position early on was one that the Constitution was corrupt, that it was a bargain with the devil, that it was a blood-soaked covenant. That was the view that William Lloyd Garrison had. Politics was a dirty, messy thing. Political compromise was unnecessary. What you had to do was hew to this line that the Constitution was a very problematic thing, and that the only way to proceed was by an appeal directly to the divine and to natural law. Douglass was of that mind for a good portion of his career. And then in 1851, having read the Constitution and come to the exact opposite conclusion, announced in his own newspaper, which he had founded, a change of opinion. He admitted that the previous justification he had given for abolitionism was wrong, and that in order to actually achieve the goal of abolitionism, he would have to become, as Abraham Lincoln had discovered, one who stood solidly on the principles of the Declaration and on the Constitution. That took, I think, a remarkable degree of humility. Because had he held fast to his position, he could have continued in the orbit of William Lloyd Garrison. But you know, once having announced that change of position, he was completely ostracized. He lost that relationship. He lost that mentorship. He lost that whole circle of friends. And he became kind of like Lincoln did in the 1850s and 60s, a man that didn't have many allies. Because it was a much harder argument to make after all. It's a much harder task to engage in the politics of persuasion, of trying to bring around your fellow citizens, of engaging in the hurly-burly of political compromise. What then is the Constitution, Frederick Douglass said in 1860? It is no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial ideal something, colored according to any man's fancy, now a weasel, now a whale, and now nothing. Douglass anticipated some of the dilemmas that we have today. How will we stand against the soft tyranny of our age? Will we stand with the Constitution and the principles of the Declaration? Will we make an argument? Will we be able to admit when our arguments have been in error? Humility and healthy pride go hand in hand. This is true in Washington, as it is anywhere. Looking at Douglass, I think what we see is a man who had a kind of quiet dignity. He knew if he stayed true to his principles that that quiet dignity would one day have the opportunity to roar, and it really did. You know, one of the things that's amazing about Douglass is not only did he stand for the abolition of enslaved Americans of African descent, he also stood solidly with the cause of women's suffrage. He was the only man to speak at Seneca Falls in 1848. And on his dying day, here in Washington, D.C., where he spent his last 17 years, he had stayed long at a convention devoted to the cause of women's suffrage. He was a person that truly believed in equality for all. Let me turn back along those lines to our current president. Even as NPR and reporters have hailed the president's humility, that was a word that I actually heard a few days ago from an NPR reporter about the president's statements regarding the problems on the Obamacare healthcare.gov website. It's really quite breathtaking to see how much the president still sees the debate not about these larger things, but about, well, himself. Sometimes people ask me, the president said a few days ago, to supporters in California, quote, how do you keep up with everything involved in this job of yours, which is kind of a crazy job? Well, you know, a few years ago, Valerie Jarrett had an answer for those people who might doubt him. I don't know if any of you have heard this passage. Bear with me if you have. Here's what Valerie Jarrett said of the current president. Quote, I think Barack knew that he had God-given talents that were extraordinary. He knows exactly how smart he is. He knows how perceptive he is. He knows what a good reader of people he is. And he knows that he has the ability, the extraordinary, uncanny ability to take 1,000 different perspectives, digest them, and make sense out of them. And I think that he has never really been challenged intellectually. So what I sensed in him was not just a restless spirit, but somebody with such extraordinary talents that had to be really taxed in order for him to be happy. He's been bored to death his whole life. He's just too talented to do what ordinary people do. End quote. Now, in 2010, when Obamacare was at its inception, to calm the concerns of some moderate Democrats, the president met with them and asked about, well, what's the difference between this moment and that of 1994 with Hillary Care? The president said this: the big difference between here and 94 is you've got me, end quote. You've got me. Now, you can scour the 2 million words that Abraham Lincoln penned, all of his speeches, all of his public pronouncements, and I will challenge you to find those words or anything that smacks of them. You've got me, right? That's not the point. Same thing in Douglass. There was a healthy pride. There was a huge ambition in both Lincoln and Douglass. There was a desire even for greatness. But there was also wedded to that and taming, keeping it in line, a humility. Humility in Washington is possible, but as anywhere, it's really hard. In our age of arrogance, all Americans have a choice. Will we live by an ethos of narcissism in a society of self-promotion, or will we regain the humility that's made us great? Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, David. We do have time for some questions, and if you will wait for the microphone and be so kind at least to give your name and an affiliation, it will be appreciated. First question.
Hi, I'm Nick. I work for the Senate. Something that, maybe you can comment on whether, this is a new phenomena or was, it's our political figures have had to deal with it throughout our country's history, is that though people, believe humility is good and, as a personal virtue, there's, they like to see a politician admit that they made a mistake. Mm-hmm. Usually it seems like with the implication that, well, that shows they're flawed, and we see, while Barbara Walters will ask President Obama where he's going to live, people would ask President Bush, well, what's a mistake you've made? And they don't ask other politicians that. With the, what I take from that is, well, if they admit to making any mistake, that's bad. I guess, do you think that's recent, or am I off base in that?
That's an interesting observation. I think it's not recent. I think that we're now in the 500th year of the existence of Machiavelli's Prince. Think of what he argued way back then. It wasn't in a way a completely novel argument, right? Because people had always said, look, we know that there's at root in human nature a rapaciousness, a desire to acquire. All of the things that we associate with the kind of the negative side of human beings. What Machiavelli said, though, that was kind of shocking and still, even 500 years on, should shock us is, that's okay. It's okay that human beings want to do that. In fact, what you need to do is use virtue and vice kind of like you would arrows in a quiver. Deploy them when necessary. And you know what? If you need to fake humility, go ahead and do it. If you need to fake any of those things which are actually good in order to perpetuate the things that you see as important, that's fine. So there's a way in which I think we have always paid a lot of lip service in our, whether elected or even amongst kings, to the idea that there should be some measure of humility. But one of the things, if you go back way to the ancient idea of magnanimity, take Aristotle's account, for example. Humility doesn't rate very well. It's hard to imagine his magnanimous man, for example, stooping to wash the feet of his disciples. Right? That's just it's not the kind of thing that figure would do. Aristotle's portrait of the magnanimous man in the Nicomachean Ethics is one of somebody who's great in reality and knows it. That's the definition of greatness of soul. Take Homer's account of greatness. It's fixed in the nature of things, right? Odysseus should not have to stoop to answer anybody beneath him. So when Thersites comes up and questions, what are we doing here? Why have we been fighting this stupid war? Odysseus strikes him. This lame, really wretched kind of guy doesn't have any right at all to question authority. So the ancient model is one in which humility is not very highly prized, if prized at all. So there has been a shift, but I think you're right, in democratic societies, we put our politicians in the difficult place, right? Because they have to say, hey, I'm the best, elect me. That's a difficult thing, right? They have to, in order to get elected. And yet we expect them to admit when they're wrong and that they're not the best in some ways. How do you pull off that kind of difficult dance is the story of Republican self-government.
Yes.
David Benowitz, I'm retired. And you mentioned about the lack of humility in politicians, but most people see the politicians through the press. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about humility in the press, or lack thereof. And you also mentioned that an NPR reporter referred to Obama as being humble. Mm-hmm. And is humility in that case in the eyes of the beholder?
Well, there's a big difference between humbling oneself and being humiliated. And certainly the rollout of the website was a humiliating experience. It's kind of like if any of you have children, you know that sometimes when you catch them doing something wrong, they're more sorry that they've been caught than for the actual deed, right? There's a way in which I think that you're right to point to some challenges within the press as well. I mean, What right now dominates a lot of press coverage? How the press covers the story that the press is covering, right? There's this kind of insular world and self-referentialism. It's interesting when you look at a book like This Town by the New York Times chief national correspondent, Mark Leibovich. So Leibovich, I was fascinated by his account of Washington because he uses phrases no fewer than 20 times that begin with the word self, self-intoxication, self-absorption. The kind of branding, self-branding, right, has become a thing. For those of you who are in congressional offices, you know that with a few rare exceptions, your bosses are out tweeting, right? What is Twitter but a grand exercise in kind of self-promotion, right? I mean, we have all of these media that are available to us, and I think the insularity of the media, too, especially in Washington, means that they are more prone to cover politicians, and yet they still like that gotcha moment, right? They can still sense when a politician is going too big on the ego front. So even as far back as 2010, there was a piece by John Harris in Politico. Does Barack Obama have an ego problem? Interesting piece and an interesting reflection. So it's a good question about the press and pride. I'm sure a book could be written about that.
One more, over here.
Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you very much for a splendid lecture. Lest I tempt you to pride, I'll share quickly an email I got from a prominent economist about Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate in economics. And this person commenting on Coase, whom he knew personally, that he was the only humble scholar that he knew. And Coase himself said he didn't know what the fuss was about getting a Nobel laureate because he only studied the obvious. But that's just preparatory. I think it's a splendid theme that you've chosen and delivered brilliantly. Could you give a little background as how you came to focus on this kind of a theme in studying both Washington and Lincoln, Douglass, and so forth? Thank you.
Well, thank you for those kind remarks, and I think that's a very interesting consideration about humility in the academy. Economics has a way, like some other disciplines, of humbling one, particularly if you're in the prognostication business. But to your question about how I came to this topic, the big book that Augustine wrote, The City of God, was a topic that I took up in graduate school. And it struck me that in this mammoth treatise that Augustine wrote with a very curious aim, to attempt to convince the proud, this is his own language, of the excellence of humility. Augustine found himself in a place in the 5th century after Christ when Rome had fallen to the Visigoths. And the charge was made that it was Christianity that sapped the virtue of the Romans, that they had become weak. And Augustine's response was to write this big defense and to say, you know, it's exactly the opposite, that Christianity does not enfeeble. It does not turn human beings into weaklings, but it's the Roman civil religion that has led to this thing. So that was a big debate. But in the course of his book, Augustine, 1,000 years before Machiavelli penned his Mirror for Princes, wrote his own. And 3 times in the course of about 12 different attributes that Augustine lays out for what a good prince ought to have at his disposal, he uses humility as an attribute. And that got me thinking just about what a revolutionary thing that is. Because especially when you're talking about an age of emperors, right? Men who thought they were quite literally divine in many cases. To counsel humility was to truly do an inverse relationship here. To say that you would take on that aspect of character was really revolutionary. And it is such a rare thing to find in leaders. And so in choosing the 5 that I did to focus on, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are our 2 greatest presidents. And I think what struck me about them is how hard they had to work, though, to come to this aspect of humility. James Madison was kind of a wimp early on in his life, especially. He physically was an unimpressive guy. He stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, 100 pounds soaking wet. He was a hypochondriac. When he wasn't feigning illness, he was actually sick. This is a guy that on many occasions throughout his life worked himself into just a complete state of exhaustion. And in his 20s, he was utterly without a purpose. And he had to figure out what that was. So he had to gain healthy pride. But I think that what Madison did in earning the title Father of the Constitution is an amazing exercise in humility. And that properly understood, our founding is not actually one that's rooted in jingoism or a kind of expansionism or a warmongering tendency. Howard Zinn says our founding was guns and greed, right? That was the 2 words that characterize our founding. It's not that. Properly understood, it was a humble founding, and it owes a lot to Madison, and also to Abby Adams. She's another figure that I focus on along with Frederick Douglass. Thanks very much for your time today, and thanks very much to Heritage.
We will not be so humble as not to point out that copies of his book are available and for sale in the lobby, and I'm sure David will be glad to sign them or talk with you further. We do thank you again for coming to join us. I'll leave us with the great admonition, pride goeth before a fall, or as our great friend, the late Ambassador Clare Boothe Luce would say to Washington politicians, be kind to all those people you are stepping on the way up, because you will meet them again on the way down. Thank you.